Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist, Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome, both of you, great to see you. So to the front pages then, let's start first of all with the Metro, which greets the development of an accurate antibody test, which will tell people if they've had COVID-19, with the headline, "Yes, it really is a game changer." The Eye says that the tests could become available within weeks. According to the Daily Express, work on a vaccine for the virus is making good progress. The Daily Mirror carries claims that 19 million people in the UK could have had the virus and recovered from it. The Daily Telegraph has seen figures which show just 24 people caught it in London in a 24-hour period. The Times understands that Boris Johnson will look to start an anti-obesity drive, given the increased risk factor it presents for contracting COVID-19. The Guardian has an exclusive report which claims there was chaos at a warehouse run by the company contracted by the government to provide personal protective equipment, while the Daily Mail launches an attack on unions, which are reluctant to send teachers back into schools amid the pandemic. The Northern Echo hears pleas from local council officials in the northeast for people not to use their seaside neighbourhoods as leisure destinations after the relaxation of the lockdown. And meanwhile, the Financial Times reports that Nissan is looking to shift production of 2 Renault cars from Spain to Sunderland. Following the burglary in which Tottenham star Dele Alli was attacked, The Sun reports that many footballers are looking to ramp up their personal security, while the Daily Star hears that celebrities and their partners on this year's Strictly Come Dancing could be forced to isolate together. Well, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott are here. Welcome both. Let's start with teaching unions, shall we? Meeting, we understand, Sir Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty tomorrow to get possibly that data that they were hoping for in order to see if schools can start back, in part at least, on June the 1st. This is turning into quite a political argument, isn't it, Sonia?
Yes, so it's turned into a real showdown. You've got the government saying that it wants some year groups to go back to school quite soon, and teaching unions have raised some very serious questions about this. First of all, they're saying that the government hasn't really made clear the scientific evidence on which that's based, and indeed you had the DfE's chief science advisor giving evidence to the Education Select Committee yesterday, saying that there isn't really strong evidence for this decision. And then secondly, teaching unions are really concerned about the safety of their staff, of children, of parents. Now, this is a really difficult conundrum because everyone wants kids to be able to go back to school as soon as possible. We know it's not good for children to be missing out on their education, particularly children from low-income backgrounds. But I think the teaching unions have every right to push back and say, well, what protections are there going to be for our members? And no one wants to put kids and teachers at risk. The Daily Mail's got a front page saying, you know, we should let our teachers be heroes. This isn't really about being heroes. We want teachers to go to work when they're protected and when children are protected. And that the Guardian story that's just flashed up is really about the latest development, which is that one of the unions has written to its members saying that, you know, they don't have to go back to work on June the 1st, or they shouldn't feel pressured into going back to work if they don't have the same levels of safety as other frontline workers do, for example, in the NHS. So it's a really difficult issue, but I think the teaching unions are absolutely right to push back. But what we've got to hope is that that the relationship is clearly broken down. Government has a responsibility to get the teaching unions on side.
Well, Isabel, the Education Secretary Gavin Williamson has actually written for the Daily Mail, calling this a do your duty moment, that the unions need to back down for the welfare and education of the children. How critical is schools returning for the government's phasing of the end of the lockdown?
Well, completely critical, and I completely disagree with Sonia's position on this. I think that the teaching unions are behaving appallingly. A lot of teachers do want to go back to school. Of course, lots of teachers are already working in a very different way, providing online learning for children. But we need to get teachers back into the classroom as soon as possible. And frankly, if we wait around for the overwhelming evidence that there is no risk at all, we'll be waiting for another 10 years. You're not going to be able to eliminate risk. We've got to be realistic about this. We're not going to be able to socially distance children in the same numbers in a classroom as we had before. So, of course, some adjustments are going to have to be made. But look, this is a question of children from the less well-off families, from deprived families. There are hundreds of thousands of children right now who are not getting the education they need and for whom school is a lifeline. If you are in a dysfunctional household, then look, some parents struggle to even get their kids out of bed and to school in the morning. In the best scheme of things, right now, those children are seriously losing out. They need to be back at school. The reality is that the government's programme of getting children from the least well-off families in school because they need it most, those on free school meals, hasn't actually worked. The statistics are pretty dire on this. So I think it's time that the teaching unions stopped agonising over what are, as far as we know, fairly marginal risks. There isn't overpowering evidence of children as kind of super spreader biohazards, and let their members get back to work, as many of them would like to do so.
Yeah, John, I was going to say, it's about parents meeting in playgrounds, having to pick up their kids as well, isn't it? There's a lot of social interaction that goes with education. Sonia?
Well, just to push back on that, I mean, I really don't think teachers would see these risks as marginal, because it's not even about whether children are super spreaders. It's just that if you're in a classroom with 30 children who spread the virus as much as an adult, and there's no reason to think that children don't spread the virus as much as an adult, and you're not doing social distancing, that really does increase the risk of the virus spreading. Now, obviously, there are measures that schools can take to reduce those risks, but really, the government needs to have a constructive conversation with the teaching unions. Teachers, as Isabel says, want to go back to work. The teaching unions desperately care about children from disadvantaged backgrounds, I'm sure, but it's about having that constructive conversation and hashing a plan out together. Whereas what we've seen is the government rush out guidance that's been poorly thought through, where teaching unions haven't been properly consulted, and that's not a recipe for getting schools back on the road.
Isabel, just quickly come back. You were shaking your head in that.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've had weeks and weeks to make these preparations. Children have already been off school for weeks, and before we know it, it's going to be the summer holiday. My fear is that the government's laudable plan to get children back in the classroom beginning at the beginning of June will now be kiboshed by these very militant unions who are busy threatening to sue the government. That is not an all-in-it-together attitude. That is not them doing their bit for the country. They are going to have to be prepared to accept a level of risk. It is a calculated risk. There is not strong evidence to suggest that children transmit this virus in a very, very worrying way. And if we're going to wait for the evidence, we'll be here till at least Christmas.
OK, I'm going to move on. I know we could debate this for ages. I think part of the difficulty for people is that they're being asked to take a calculated risk to get back to work when they still haven't been able to go and see their own families. And perhaps it's the order that things were done, that if you wanted to go and see your vulnerable parents, having been in lockdown for weeks and weeks, you feel safer than having been at work for a couple of weeks. Possibly that's part of the issue. Sonia?
Yeah, I think I think some of the issues around that has been that the government hasn't been upfront and transparent about why it's taking the decisions it's taking and the evidence on which it's based. So you get the impression, you're right, Anna, that the government thinks we may be able to tolerate a slight increase in the contact rate of between people, and it's decided to prioritise economic contact over family contact. But if that's a decision it's taken, it should be upfront with us and tell us so we can all understand that that's the basis on which it was taken.
In the meantime, if we move to the Times, still looking at risk factors about this infection. Boris Johnson, the paper says, is to launch a war on fat or obesity after the virus scare, not least for him, Isabel.
Well, Boris seems to have undergone some kinds of personality change. I mean, this is a politician who once said in response to Jamie Oliver's campaign for healthier school meals that parents should be encouraged or allowed to kind of push pies through the school gates for their children. He's always been very anti kind of putting fat taxes on food and using what he would previously has regarded as nanny state mechanisms to try to encourage people to have a healthier weight. He himself has had weight problems. You know, he is a heavier man. I think one of the papers has put him at 17 stone at one point. So this is somebody who certainly understands how difficult it is to maintain a healthy weight. But what we've seen with coronavirus is an extremely strong correlation between the chances of it hitting you really hard and those who are suffering from conditions like diabetes, which are strongly linked to obesity. So, you know, it makes every sense to do whatever the government can to encourage people to really to get on top of their weight issues.
And in the meantime, hopes are pinned once again on either a vaccine or on antibody testing. 2 companies have now been approved by Public Health England. The Daily Mirror has that story on the front page, and also a Manchester University study which seems to suggest that very large numbers of people may already have had it, Sonia.
I would take that headline, I'm afraid, with a big pinch of salt. I've had a look at the study that underlies it, and it's based on a model that's based on estimates of how many people may have had it, but it's only one model, and it's essentially an educated guesstimate, and other educated guesstimates say different things and think that far fewer people may have had it. But the real sort of nub of this story is the idea of this new antibody test that's accurate, that will be able to tell accurately whether you've had the virus or not. And once the government can get that out to a sample of the population, that's when we'll have an accurate idea of how many people have had it. And that will be really important, first of all, in kind of feeding into our knowledge about the immunity levels that we might have to this virus, and also understanding how many people have had it. So that's important, but I'm afraid I think this headline does need to be treated with a bit of healthy scepticism.
Yes, the second company, Abbott, has followed Roche in being approved by public health bodies in the UK. It says it has the capability to produce 5 million tests each month for the health service effort, an enormous number, certainly. The problem is we don't know if antibodies mean immunity. We don't know for how long. We don't know if there are strains of this virus and you can't get cross-immunity with them. There are so many questions as we hold on to these slivers of hope in terms of coronavirus, Isabel.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's naturally desperate for something positive at this point, and anything that can help us on antibodies is going to be welcomed. But you're right. I mean, as you say, we don't know. That there have been quite worrying reports of people getting it twice. Now, whether they actually suffer to the extent they did at the first time round, the second time round, is not very clear. It may well be that people contract the virus again, but don't actually fall as ill, in which case, then, you know, that is obviously not as bad for them. But are they then as infectious as they were the first time? So there are an awful lot of unanswered questions. But the science is moving very fast here. And it is obviously fantastic if we have some sort of mini breakthrough.
Indeed so. And I think one study in South Korea suggested that the sensitivity of the test couldn't distinguish between live and dead virus, and that might be why some people appeared to be testing twice. But as you say, it's a novel virus and there's lots still to learn, isn't there? Plenty more still to come. Could free parking persuade people not to take public transport in these socially distanced times? Back with that in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go straight to the Northern Echo, shall we, Isabel? Our home is not your playground. Not the first area that's been saying this. Please don't come.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this is so awful. I happen to live in one of the nicest parts of England, in the Cotswolds, and I would be delighted if people come here for the day for their exercise. You know, this idea that people who live in some of these beautiful places want to turn their neighbourhoods, their local areas into some kind of hostile environment for outsiders, I think is really insidious. It's just bad kind of community spirit. And I think it's really unnecessary. People are not, in fact, going to flock in great numbers, very long distances to areas where they can't actually go to a cafe and where the public toilets aren't open, there are no amenities. So I think this is a cooked up problem, and I'm really pretty sick of seeing these types of stories.
Well, at the beginning, it did look like in some places, like the Lake District, that all the B&Bs and the holiday homes were completely full of people trying to lock down somewhere that wasn't a city in a flat or something, wasn't there? So it did feel like a problem at the start. But should people be allowed to travel hundreds of miles for a day out on a beach and not be told to go away by the local residents?
I think there's a difference between sort of going to a second home or moving somewhere else to try and set out a lockdown, or driving hundreds of miles and then maybe, you know, say driving 30 miles or an hour to a place of natural beauty, which is big and open, where you can go for a walk, where actually it may be easier to socially distance from others than it is, say, in your local park in a more built up area. So I think there's a lot of nuance to this, and people kind of have to use their common sense. But I do think driving hundreds of miles is a problem, because actually it's not great to be on the roads, on the motorways for hours on end. There's risk of accidents, etc. It is much better if people keep to a sensible distance, I suppose, within their own home. But I have much more sympathy, I suppose, than Isabel, for people living in local areas who might be worried about their spots becoming very overcrowded. And I think, you know, there may be a risk of that happening in some areas. You might consider, for example, Brighton Beach. So I have some more sympathy for it. But I also do think there is a bit of a worrying trend. There's a sort of fun police trend where, you know, because we're all in lockdown, even if we're doing something that's safe, we're perhaps not really allowed to have fun, which I think is not a very healthy attitude. I think if you can have fun safely, that's absolutely brilliant, and you should be doing it.
Yes, and multiple studies now showing how important vitamin D is, from sunshine, obviously, about the severity of the illness and getting it in the first place. Quick thought on free parking to avoid public transport chaos. We heard Grant Shapps today, the Transport Secretary, says unusually he's there trying to get people to avoid public transport. Isabel, do things need to happen, do you think, to allow people to get to work to avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, if the government is now saying, as Grant Shapps is, that we have a civic duty to avoid public transport, then things have to be put in place to make it easier for people to take other options. The government is exceptionally keen, and Boris Johnson himself very keen on improving provision for cyclists. And as for parking, I mean, that's a massive problem in central London. You find yourself paying over £20 for a couple of hours if you have a particularly old car. They get penalised. So absolutely that will help. But look, I mean, perish the thought of everybody descending onto central London in their cars. I think that those that can still work at home will choose to do so, because it all sounds a nightmare. Public transport, car, the lot of it, really.
Yeah, just 20 seconds left. Sonia, do you think we'll see a real shift in the economy, that people actually won't be travelling to work?
I think for those of us who are lucky enough to have white-collar professional jobs and can do them from home and have the luxury of keeping us safe, I think people like us will continue to work from home more. But I think there are lots of people who absolutely do not have that luxury. They have to travel into work. They may not own cars. It's all very well for Grant Shapps to say you've got a civic duty to avoid public transport, but that's obviously very difficult if you don't have a car.
Sonia Sodha, Isabel Oakeshott, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.